All right, welcome back to the channel, or welcome if you're new. I've got two decks for you today in Legacy, in my pursuit of Legacy excellence. One is a deck that I am currently not playing. However, it is the one before you, and the next will be the one that I am playing. However, I think it's important to cover one, because one of my opponents actually asked for the deck list, and I told him I would post it in my next video, and I want to make good on my word. And in fact, I would say it wasn't just that person, that's the one that comes to mind, but I think it was like a total of 4 or 5 people over the course of testing this deck asked for the list. And two, I want to point out that I don't think this is the best version of this deck. I actually think, even looking at it now, I can think of ways to improve it, and I may need to scratch that itch and like actually improve this deck and try to get it optimized. But for a first pass, it did pretty well, and it's definitely an enjoyable deck to play. I'm going to run through it. Then at the end, I'll explain to you a little bit about my concerns about why I'm not certain that it is the deck to play, what my concerns are, and then I'll show you the deck that I think probably is the deck to play, most likely given away by the name of the deck list on the left if you hadn't noticed it already. But let's start with this deck. So if you don't know, if you're not familiar with Magic the Gathering's history going all the way back to the Misty, the breaking of the millennium, in fact 2001 would be the era, then you may not know much about what was previously the extended format, which lasted for I think all of a year. But extended was how we essentially, they wanted to move away from Vintage. Back then Vintage was, or Type 1 was ultimately called Vintage, but back then it was actually Standard. So in Standard, the Standard format was dominated by a handful of decks, and they wanted to have a rotating format, probably so they could continue to sell cards, for one thing. And so they made the wise decision to keep the format, but to go ahead and extend forward a more limited pool of cards. And so they figured out what their ban list was, and it was an interesting set of choices. You can look at it if you're a Magic history buff. But basically, they didn't necessarily draw the line like they do with Modern at everything with this border, or they didn't draw the line it was essentially closer to what Legacy is now. They actually just picked out key cards and banned them, so you would have some discrepancies in the format, and it was just an interesting time. And I believe at that time Necropotence was, you could play 4 of them, for example, right? And now it's a banned card. So things aren't lining up 1-to-1 back then with where we're at today. But it created this format in which because you could play 4 Necropotence, a deck took over. And for, I guess, a little bit more history, at that time there was some sort of fad. I remember it, but I don't remember, like, I wasn't caught up in it, but I just sort of, you just learned what the meta decks were called. And for some reason, among the pros, of which I was still working towards being on the Pro Tour, right? But I think by then I'd made Nationals, but I hadn't made I hadn't won a PTQ yet. So they were naming decks after breakfast cereals, and yeah, I mean, I don't know. So there was a deck called Full English Breakfast. There was a deck called Trix, which is what this one's called. There was a deck called Cocoa Pebbles. There was a deck called Fruity Pebbles, and then a deck called Cocoa Pebbles. And there were, I'm probably forgetting some. So, for example, to take an example of the Pebbles one, the Fruity Pebbles decks it was a blue, white, red deck mostly that used Goblin Bombardment, which is a red enchantment, and a white enchantment that would cause creatures to return to your hand when they were sacrificed, but you couldn't cast creatures. And the way that it worked was you'd get an Ornithopter into play. They would return to play when sacrificed, I believe is how it worked. So the way the deck worked was they would try to get an Ornithopter into play, or a Shield Wall, a 0-mana artifact creature that they could that they could sacrifice. Oh, I remember how the white enchantment worked. I'm sorry. The way that it worked was, and I forget the name of it, but I forget the name of it. But basically the way it worked was whenever you drew a card, you had to show your opponent, you had to reveal a card. So basically you drew your cards face up. And when you drew a creature, you discarded it rather than drawing it. You would put it in the graveyard. And so it was Enduring Renewal. That's the name of the cards. You can look it up. But if a creature died, it would go back to your hand. So any creatures you had in play were essentially infinite, but you could never get new creatures into your hand. So if you had no creatures in play, like if your opponent Wrath of Godded you, you really couldn't afford to play your enchantment until you got something into play and it stuck. There was always like the risk somebody would Swords to Plowshares in response, and then you were hosed, right? So the way that deck worked was it would get a 0-mana artifact into play, and then it would play the Enduring Renewal, and with Goblin Bombardment, it could then sacrifice a creature to deal 1 to any target. Enduring Renewal would return the 0 casting cost creature to the owner's hand, and then they would just loop that and kill the opponent. And it was called Fruity Pebbles because the colors of the cards, I think, blue, white, red, and maybe there was some other stuff mixed in there. And and everything was being named after cereal, like I said. So that was kind of like one of the combo decks of the time. When they added Necropotence to it, because at some point everybody realized that adding Necropotence was the key to making every deck better. All decks got better when you added Necro. And this is leading up to Necro getting banned a little bit later. But they added Necropotence to it, then they called it Cocoa Pebbles, because now it had black in it. And then there was an Illusions Donate deck, which ran Necropotence, so prior to the one that you're looking at. So it actually preceded this one. So for the Fruity Pebbles to Cocoa Pebbles evolution, it actually moved in the direction you would expect, where people got smart about Necro and then added Necro and made the deck better. But in the Trix side of the house, the previous deck, the Illusions Donate deck, was blue-black, and it ran Dark Rituals and Demonic Consultation, which wasn't even banned at the time, wasn't restricted at the time. And so it would consult to just get Necro or a combo piece and put it together, and then get Necro to fuel a giant hand filled with Forces of Will, and then it would put together the Illusions of Grandeur Donate combo. And Illusions of Grandeur, because it gave you 20 life, basically for the Necro player, it just said like, hey, draw 20 more cards and keep the combo going if you need to. And so that deck was utterly insane, super dominant in the format at the time. And then Necro I think it was Necropotence got banned, and I think Consult got banned, if I'm remembering correctly. And then everyone just assumed that the Donate Illusions combo was dead. If you're not familiar with this combo, Illusions of Grandeur is an enchantment that gives you 20 life, but it has an accumulated upkeep of 2, and when it leaves play in any way, so disenchant, bounce, whatever, the controller of Illusions of Grandeur loses 2 life. And the key is it's not the owner, it's the controller. And so what you would do is you would play Illusions to gain 20, and then you would donate it to your opponent, and then they would be stuck with a card that had a cumulative upkeep of 2 that quickly just ramps out a hand, which, if it leaves play, they lose 20 life. So even if they drew like a disenchant, like I said, or a bounce spell, if they're staring at their own illusions, they can't disenchant or bounce it because they'll die on the spot, unless they're over 20. So the way that control decks would try to deal with this if they couldn't stop the combo is they would like plow their own creature and try to get above 20, right? So, but it's exceedingly hard against. Anyway, there's a lot of reasons why that would have been difficult then, and was certainly would be difficult now in a format that even runs Forces of Wills and Plows, and would be even more difficult then, mainly because the control decks typically just don't have enough creatures to target, for starters. And then in game 2, they often can't afford to leave Plows in against a creatureless deck, so there's another reason why it's really hard for them to solve the problem in that way. And it only temporarily solves the problem because you can just combo again if you need to. So, having said all that, this deck took Kai Buddha to, I believe, second place in an extended tournament. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about the engine that ran it, which is these. This is the combo, but this is the real engine right here. and it's powered off from this. It's off of intuition. So what you do basically is you tap out for Sapphire Medallion with like Force Up, ideally. And as long as they don't mess with Sapphire Medallion or play something that's a big problem, like if it's just some aggro creatures, you just let them have it. And then you, on the next turn, for 2 mana, you Intuition, and you get 3 AKs. 2 of them go to the graveyard immediately. And then for 1 blue, I didn't mean, my mouse is funky. And then for 1 blue, you cast the remaining accumulated knowledge and draw 3 cards. Well, what I realized is I was thinking about extended, legacy rather, was that accumulated knowledge was that, first of all, we have more Force of Wills, which helps the deck a little bit more, and secondly, we have a new card, Mystic Sanctuary, which will allow you to constantly return the accumulated knowledges that you've spent. So Mystic Sanctuary becomes regrowth for Ancestral Recall. And if anyone's played Old School, one of the classic win cons is you just simply play Ancestral Recall as many times as you can, and you will win that game somehow, one way or another, even if your deck doesn't have a lot of like problem solving in it, right? Other than just like some counters. And the fact is, Magic hasn't changed so much that that's not still true, barring something like maybe a Bowmasters or a Hull Breacher to stop you, or an Narset maybe. But, and because Bowmasters, Hull Breacher, and Narset, among those 3, the common thread is Bowmasters, and the other commonality between the other 2 is that they're blue, I figured I could just run Fire Ice to take out Bowmasters, and run main deck Red Blasts to deal with the blue permanents, and I would have solutions to the 2 things that would threaten me from going off, while also having cards that are really good against other control decks, because, you know, having main deck Red Blast against blue-based decks is also great, and being able to tap their lands at the end of their turn, and being able to play a 2-color deck that can afford to run Wastelands while being land light was also excellent. So that's kind of the thinking behind this deck. And then, like I said, we'll cover the Reanimator, but for those of you familiar with Legacy, there are some innovations, but not a tremendous quantity of them, so it'll be a little bit less novel, probably need less explanation than what you're seeing here. So then you say, well, I'm also running Stifles, which supports the Wasteland ability. So, well, that's okay, but I mean, do you really even care about stifling? And the answer is generally no. But Stifle gives me, besides being able to hit an early fetch land or Wasteland to disrupt my opponent, it also gives me resilience against Storm. And it also is a combo with Illusions of Grandeur, because what I can do is I can play Illusions if I'm in a bit of trouble, gain my 20 life, I can just let it go and then stifle the effect. You know, maybe I'm holding a second Illusions, but I haven't found a single donate, so I just play one, stifle the effect, play another one, and eventually donate that sucker off, but I now have like 20 more life to work with. So that's the reasoning for the Stifles in the deck. Other than that, I think the original version ran 4 donates and 4 illusions. It also had some other changes. It had like a couple impulses. Didn't run 4 brainstorms because back then there were no fetches, so brainstorm wasn't as good. And of course there were no Lorians. I don't know if it ran any factor fictions. It may have ran 1. So there were other changes, you know, that exist in the old version of the deck. I mean, I wasn't trying to replicate it. I was just trying to draw inspiration from it. And so I started playing, and I was actually doing extremely well, like I said. So I will run through games with this, and then I will explain why I shifted to Reanimator and why I don't necessarily think that this is the way to go. But I will revisit it in the future. As far as the sideboard goes, I like to work, because of intuition, I like to operate where I can in groups of 3 for the less important cards. It's one of the things that I might change up about this deck later. But anyway, so I already have the blasts, but I may want to pick up some more for games 2 and 3 against control. So I added a copy of 3 that I could possibly bring in, which gives me a total of 6. And remember these, well, you'll see in a minute the other reason why we run the blasts. It's not just the Narsets in the world, but then we have 3 surgical extractions, so we can just intuition grab one and extract their key card, you know, their life from the loam or their whatever Slime Against Humanity. But we're not trying to actually control them in that manner. It's just there as an insurance policy. 3 blue blasts. And if you're wondering why I'm running like a weird mix of pyro and red blasts, like whenever possible, I'm mixing up cards like that. The reason is because of surgical extraction, so that it's harder for your opponent to count how many of each copy of the specific card that I have. Like how many red blasts do I actually have? I saw a red blast and a pyro. So is he running like one each, or is he running like, what's the count? So that's part of the reason. And the other is just if one of them gets surgically extracted, you still have access to the other one. So anyway, that's why we want to mix up our blasts. But anyway, so we run 3 blue blasts just to assist in the mono red matches, and because they might be fast enough to kill you before you can kill them, kind of a thing, before you can get your illusions on board and gain your 20 life. 3 pyroclasms to also help with that. So these are essentially blue blasts numbers 4, 5, and 6 against goblins, but also really good against like mono white, and also a solution to Orcish Bowmasters. Again, a card that we're concerned with, as well as a card like Douthie Voidwalker. All those like really good cheap black creatures that punish what our deck's trying to do. Die to Pyroclasm conveniently enough, as well as Fire Ice. And then 3 copies of Null Rod because a dedicated deck dumping out Moxes and all kinds of crazy stuff, as well as a lot of the Graveyard Hate, which is frequently artifact based, like Tormod's Crypt and stuff, that we don't necessarily want to be punished by because we're running AKs and Mystic Sanctuaries for Recursion. Null Rod can interrupt and interfere with a good number of those. So that was the reasoning behind the sideboard. We'll run into some games, and then, like I said, we'll switch gears and we'll go into the other deck. And so I have to go back a ways because you can see I've been playing quite a bit of Legacy. My record's pretty strong. You'll see some. This is with the current deck. So from the 23rd and 22nd, you'll see that I had some losses here. I ran into a string of losses. Loss, win, loss, and I believe somewhere around here is where I switched decks in. You can see there's a gap in time, and then I pick up with like an occasional loss here and there, but mostly wins with the new deck. But let's talk about the old one and why I was running into the losses. But I'll start with some positives. We'll just go all the way back to the 20th, and we'll just run through some games, and this will incidentally touch on the opponent who asked for the deck list, where I believe was Mixel. MX or Mixie, which obviously Roman numerals, I can't remember what M and I are, but I probably should look that up and figure out it's probably intended to be a number referring to something. But anyway, we'll start here though against Good Ol' Rock, and this is a great opening hand. Obviously we would prefer Pyroblast to be Force of Will against an unknown opponent. It's a little bit early for Illusions and Fact or Fiction as well. But any hand with mana, Sapphire Medallion, and an Intuition is almost always a keep, so I keep. And I'll lead off with Scalding Tarn to protect. I think the list is exactly what I showed you. If there's any discrepancies, I'll mention it, but it's a very straightforward deck list. All right, I'm going to play Steam Vents here. It's really not, I don't sack at the end of turn. Oh yeah, I did have, that is a discrepancy. I did have exactly one copy of, in the current version, I think I have 3 Sanctuaries, and I think I had 1 copy of Steam Vents and 2 Sanctuaries, but then I couldn't Intuition for them, and I changed it later. So, all right, my opponent cycles a Lorien revealing an island. So I'm going to. They do it at my end step, so they're tapped out. They can't Bowmaster me, so this is a great time to go ahead and Brainstorm, and then we'll adjust our hand here. We've got the combo, but I don't necessarily want a combo yet. And I think I still want, I can't remember if I still want the top card. No, I guess I don't. So I cycle, or I crack during my upkeep, and then I go ahead and cast a Sapphire Medallion. Opponent has a Spell Snare main deck, which is interesting. So that Pyroblast comes in handy. Probably annoying if you're them to get Pyroblasted in game 1. But then they run out to Fairy. So my opponent is probably relieved, frankly, to see the Pyroblast. For my turn, I go ahead and cycle into a land and recur my Pyroblast, because it's clearly going to be good against them. play Sapphire Medallion and pass. And I could accumulate knowledge into that and just blast the Teferi off, but I am not. That's a mistake I believe that people will make with this deck. You don't want to. You don't want to. You will. It's okay to cycle off and accumulate knowledge like that, but in general, you don't want to. You want to hold it and then intuition. And what if you do that? If you intuition first while holding an AK, two of them go to the graveyard, one, and then you're holding two of them. The first one draws 3, and the second one draws 4. So if I cycled this off on this turn and Pyroblasted that, for example, one, there's no guarantee that they wouldn't just play it, slam another one, and bounce this again. And two, I'm throwing away 4 cards and getting 1 in exchange when I could hold this and have a 1 mana card that draws 4. So I think I'd rather do that. So I just chill, not in a big rush. I'm not under any pressure. And Teferi interrupts with my counter spells, but I don't even have any. I mean, I have maybe Teferi dies here. Nope, my opponent Force of Wills here. I'm super happy to see that. All right, I'll just cast it main phase. Got a counter for this? No. How about one of these? No, all Ancestral. And then why don't I go ahead and just draw 4 now while we're at it and pass. And you see how much more insane that is, right? I throw away a Delta here because I'm going to... I've got another land here, and I might hit a land drop anyway because I drew almost all spells. Opponent Leyline Binding's my Medallion, realizing how dangerous it is now, but it's a little late. I'm going to go ahead and play Illusions out and jump up to 37. So I'm not worried about any kind of aggression from my opponent. They're down to 3 cards in hand. We'll play the upkeep here and draw. And then let's just see if I can draw some extra cards with Lorien. Does that work? No? How about, can I kill you? I guess so. So my opponent now has an upkeep of 4 that they have to pay. And like I said, they can Teferi it or Leyline Binding it, but they still lose. It doesn't matter. They could bounce their own Leyline Binding and cast it on Illusions, but they're dead. Now if my opponent had countered that, then I could pay 4, and I still had 2 mana, and it only takes 1 for donate. So what I could do at that point was I would pay 4, and then I would, with 2 mana left, I would cycle Lorien Revealed into Mystic Sanctuary, play Sanctuary, and recur another draw 4. So then I would have 2 lands, and I would have 2 lands to start, tap 1 for the Sanctuary, fetch, play the Sanctuary untapped, so I still have 2 mana left. And then I have an AK on top of my deck. Then I brainstorm into the accumulated knowledge, right? And then I go ahead and AK for 4. And theoretically, in that top 4, I will have drawn +2, +5, I guess, in that top 5. I would have drawn another land, and then I just donate again to them. So that's if they had countered the donate, but they don't, so they die. And we move into game 2. And, of course, I've got even more red elemental blasts if I want them, and, you know, I decide that I do. It's a little bit hard to sideboard with this stack, but it's not, like, crazy hard. Crazy difficult. Opponent cycles Lorien for a basic island. So I'm a bit concerned here because I'm worried about back to basics, but with all my red blasts, I should be relatively safe. Also, I just run a higher quantity of... basic lands in this deck. You know, I have enough that I can be mostly safe. My opponent cycles for a chop, ponders off the chop, which is unusual. They must be concerned about Wasteland potentially getting them. I find a Sapphire Medallion. I'm just waiting on my fetches. And I run out the Medallion. It sticks, which is huge. If it doesn't get removed, I get so much mana advantage out of this that it's going to be very hard for my opponent to win. They cycle into a Tundra and pass. Bad news for the opponent. Alright, we'll just pay a basic land there. And pass for the turn. Let's see if they've got anything. They've got 7 cards in hand. They go for a Leyline Binding, but it's a bit late now. I'm going to go ahead and fetch a Volcanic and cast Intuition in response. And I get triple AK, of course. Accumulating knowledge. Does it work? Oh, it sticks. Beautiful. Okay, yeah, it's bound. But now look, the advantage me in that exchange, right? So I go ahead and Wasteland him here, taking him off an entire color, which is one of the other nice things about just being 2 colors, is I don't have that vulnerability. Opponent is still missing green at this point. Alright, so at the end of their turn, I'm going to Intuition with Red Blast up. It resolves, so yeah, you could see there was like a couple of differences in this version. But I opt for triple Sapphire Medallion and play one. I have an Otawara. Oh yeah, I should have an Otawara in the version I showed you. I apologize. That is something that does belong in this deck. They go for an Unexpectedly Absent. I Intuition in response. They Force of Will. I Red Blast it, and they Blue Blast. So at the end of all this, my Medallion's gone, but I just recurred my Accumulated Knowledge. And I'm holding Otawara. And I'm out of Sapphire Medallions, almost. But here, I'm just going to Lorien into their Teferi. It sticks, and whoop, back to Fact or Fiction land and Accumulated Knowledge. They bounce the Sapphire, play a Carpet, so they've got all kinds of mana, but only 2 cards in hand at this point. And play Sapphire Medallion again, kill their Teferi because they just used it. Attempt to AK, force with my combo piece, keeping Fact or Fiction, and I get to draw 3 more cards off AK. Ancestral again into Pyroblast this time. And yeah, my opponent's down to 1 card at this point. Whereas I continuously am attacking their mana and putting my combo into play. A Fact or Fiction. And my opponent makes 2 piles like this. I go ahead and take the one that finishes my combo and also just draws me more cards plus a counterspell, basically. And I don't even bother wastelanding them. It's not, there's no reason to. I can spend the mana better than they can. I'm done with Intuitions. I have everything I need here. I am going to waste them once more in a moment. They go ahead and recur their Force of Will to the top of their library, but with 1 card in hand and a Force of Will on top. I'm not super worried at all, obviously. I'm brainstorming, finding a Force of Will of my own. Now I'm going to waste them because now they're down to... They can't brainstorm into Force of Will and then cast it. So I go ahead and Illusions, and I'm just going to donate it with 3 counter spells up. And after it resolves, I don't need to see what's going on over there. I just immediately Pyroblast to kill him. And that's the other reason, of course, Pyroblast is in here, is that you can just do that. And so I hand them an Illusions and then donate it, Pyroblast them, and they immediately drop. And this is just basically, if they had Uro, I don't want them to, go to 23 life somehow, or, in any other way, gain life, a land that gives them a life, something like that. I don't want that. I had Fire Ice if they only gained 1 or 2, but... just makes a nice, clean, easy victory when it's mathematically deterministic. There's literally no card that could have stopped me that I can imagine. I don't think there's any stifles with like split second on them. I mean, I was playing as though the last card in the hand might have been Stifle, and they could stifle the Illusions effect if I donated it to them. Was the other possibility, but I had that covered. All right, so in Berserk is my opponent for this second match, and my opponent leads off with Leyline, and this could be quite a problem if he has the 1 mana or 2 mana, I think 4/4 with can't be targeted and pro everything. That could be some pretty bad stuff. Opponent wisely forces my Sapphire Medallion using Lorien Revealed, and then cycles Lorien Revealed to hit their land drop. I just play Wasteland, and then at the end of their turn, I play Intuition, and my opponent concedes. I don't know why they scooped here, other than the fact that their hand was probably pretty clunky, but they're 100% dead, right? Like, if they Force a Will this, going down to 2 cards, I'm going to force a negation with Donate, and it's almost certainly going to resolve at that point. And once it does, we already know what's going to happen, right? I'm going to play a land. I'm going to... AK. I'm gonna AK, and then I'm gonna AK again, and more than likely, I mean, at that point I've drawn seven extra cards. Like, the game's 100% over. Like, they're dead. So we just move on to game 2, and I'm worried that my opponent's gonna bring in like a Leyline here, but they don't, and just lead with a basic Plains. It's got to be one of the worst starts that their deck is capable of. I lead with Island. They Lorien into Tropical. And their start suddenly looks a lot better now. So I try to seek a Force of Will, potentially, to deal with an Up the Beanstalk, because they're going to generate some card advantage with that, but failed to find one. So during my upkeep, I don't want the top 2 cards of my deck, so I cycle during upkeep so that I can draw a new card, and also grab a Volcanic for that Red Blast in my hand. At the end of my opponent's turn, since I have another blue card for Force of Will, I may Brainstorm, but I opt not to, because the longer I can hold off on Brainstorm, the stronger essentially that it gets, and I currently don't have a cycling ability. So during my opponent's upkeep, I ice them and then strip their Tropical after they tutored for a Xander's Lounge. And my opponent surgically extracts my Wastelands. He can't resist, which is a problem, I think a mistake, because I have a much better target called Accumulated Knowledge. I guess they're planning to counter it or maybe kill me before it matters. But I've taken out their green, which is pretty good. Alright, so now I'm going to improve my hand one way or the other. And here we go. We are getting set up. Alright, with Sanctuary, I decided to recur Lorien Revealed. I think in hindsight this was probably a mistake. But it gave me the option basically to put a spell that draws cards or gives me land on the next turn, or I can force with it. So that was kind of the thinking. Probably what I should have done was just and also I just put a good card for the long game in my deck. Anyway, end of turn, I play a Sapphire Medallion and go for an end of turn Intuition. My opponent counters it, but since I did put the Lorien Revealed on top, how about if I cast that? Opponent forces, so I Red Blast, they force again, and Lorien fails to resolve. They're exiling Leylines of the Guild Pact here. But unfortunately for them, the forces they're using are Force of Negation, so they're not drawing extra cards up the Beanstalk. And on their turn they play land and they just concede, which is, it feels premature, but it's reasonable. I'm certainly going to Ancestral here again. This is a deck of like infinite Ancestral Recalls. These cannot stay in play. And like when it comes to what's stronger, up the Beanstalk for them or Sapphire Medallion for me, Sapphire Medallion blows up the Beanstalk away in this specific deck. So, all right, and then I play against what is that, 16? 116? I can't remember. I'll have to Google it. Anyway, Mixie. I'm just going to say Mixie. I'm playing against Mixie, and I'm using my Trixie deck. So, yeah. Anyway, so I've got a very acceptable keep here. Could be a bit of a blowout if I get an early Stifle going. Opponent leads with City of Traders into Chromox, so they're on probably Goblins. I got to stop their red mana, and it's like buys me. It's like basically a null or disenchant on Chromox for a single mana. It's a weird play to make, but it's the correct play. As you can see, it saved me a ton of damage. Alright, so now my opponent has to play a land to destroy their City of Traders so they can get some red mana going. And of course I'm going to Brainstorm in response, get rid of that Red Blast, and then I'm going to force with Donate. So I'm down on cards quite a bit, but I have Sapphire Medallion, Intuition AK, and my opponent plays a Rabble Master. Okay. I don't want that top card, so I go ahead and just get Basic Island, and then I Intuition here and immediately AK, and find a land, which allows me to immediately AK a second time, and look at that. Just like that, I just time twisted myself. I just drew 7 cards. Opponent then goes for a, I pass, and my opponent then goes for a Name Sticker Goblin, which I force a will, exiling a second copy of Donate. So they just hit me with this Rabble Master and some more creatures. Life total is getting a little low here, but I do have Fire Ice. So for my turn, I go ahead and crack a Fetch and Mystic Sanctuary for a third draw 4 effect off of the AK, and pass. All right, I'm gonna ice their Goblin during up, and then grabbing the AK, and then AK for 4 cards. Oh yeah, I had a copy of Cyclonic Rift in the deck. There's a number of changes that this deck went through, but it's incorrect. Anyway, my opponent then plays a Battlecry Goblin and give all his Goblins haste, and in response I kill 2 of them. So he hits me for 4 here. But I go ahead and Intuition into 3 copies of Illusions of Grandeur, which costs 3 at this point, and slam it, and I'm at 25 now. Opponent plays a Goblin Matron. That's fine, I allow it. They grab a Broadside Bombardier, activate Battlecry Goblin, get in there with a ton of damage, and just rip my face from 25 to 8. 17 points of damage. But unfortunately 17 for my opponent is not enough to win, so I'm going to go ahead and just donate that over to them, and we'll Red Elemental Blast that, and not even mess with them paying, because they could pay the upkeep here and then kill me, but Red Blast for the win, right? I could have also Rifted it, but that'll do. So Rift, if you're wondering why I considered this to be even reasonably or slightly reasonably an option, it's because, first of all, you can see here that I could just pay the 6. It's because of Sapphire Medallion making this thing cost progressively less and less and less mana. With a couple of medallions out like 5 mana, 3 medallions it's 4, and so forth. It's a very powerful effect to buy a lot of time, and it works hand in hand with illusions as well. And since I didn't know what kind of sideboard people were going to bring in, I felt like having the card was decent. In hindsight, I think Echoing Truth is a better card, but... oh yeah, I had Meltdowns. I didn't have Null Rods, I'm sorry. That's actually... Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if Meltdown or Null Rod is better. I think Meltdown may actually be, and it's quite possible that I should switch the Null Rods into Meltdowns here. But I have to take a mulligan regardless, and... Oh, I guess I had a mix of Meltdowns and Null Rods. I was really anti-artifact. Alright, well anyway, my opponent's got turn 1 Rabblemaster off a Simian Spirit Guide, and I've got a Blue Blast here, so I go ahead and just blast it off a basic island for safety. Opponent then name sticker goblins into Broadside Bombardiers. That's not so good. Alright, well, I'm going to kill the Bombardier. I'm still feeling relatively good about the situation. Okay, I shut down their artifact mana. I'm just going to play a tap Sanctuary. I've got Force of Will up. Got a Blue Blast. Let's just take that threat off the table. Like, I'm feeling relatively fine here. Opponent just gets their Ancient Tomb into place. I just decided to bounce this thing for tempo. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and grab a Mystic Sanctuary and then Sanctuary up a Blue Blast. How do I lose this game? Because I clearly lost. Opponent then plays a tapped Shatter Skull the Hammer. That's a weird choice to see. Oh, I remember how I lose this game. Yeah, because of absolute, just like a wild amount of unlock. I draw Accumulated Knowledge. Again, hold it. We're gonna hold it and try to wait for an Intuition if possible, right? Opponent goes for a Hardcast Fury, which is clearly got to be dealt with. I just go ahead and AK in response and let it hit and then blow it away. But I can now recur Lorien. I think that casting the AK in response was incorrect there once again. I don't play the Sapphire Medallion in my hand though because my opponent has so much mana and I need to hardcast Force of Will. Which I'm like, well, if he blasts here, I'm dead. But it resolves, so I can now cast Lorien Revealed and get more cards in my hand, and I do, including 2 Fire Ices, which is really nice. My opponent plays a couple of Simian Spirit Guides and is out of gas. So, feeling pretty good about the situation. And I think I can kill these and I can buy time, but what I was thinking is that if I ice these, I'm much better off. Opponent finds a Battlecry Goblin here, plays it. And I'm going to go ahead and gives his guys haste, but I'm going to go ahead and tap it and draw another card. I'm much better off if I just, because my deck is just nothing but card draw and then a handful of counters, right? So all I need is any card draw here, and I don't find it. I find nothing. I'm like completely flabbergasted. The thing is, I just went down 23 cards. I drew exactly 1 Accumulated Knowledge and a Lorien Revealed and 3 Ices, right? In a deck that looks like this, right? So there were 3 Lorien Revealeds left. Illusions would have been fine too. So any illusions would have been a hit. So that's 6. Factor Fiction 7, 8. I think I cut the Factor Fictions to be honest for the sideboard, but 4 Brainstorms, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 4 Brainstorms, 4 Intuitions. So that's 4, 8 illusions, 9, 10. 11, Loriens, 12, 13, 14, plus AKs, 15, 16, 17. So there was 17 cards in my deck with 37 left. So like every other card was card drawing or a game-winning play. And so I banked on the odds. I felt the odds were in my favor that if I looked at 3 cards with Fire Ice and every other card in my deck was a winner, that I should grab a winner. Also, like if you look at the number of lands that I've drawn, totally insane, right? I have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lands out of my deck. In a deck with 18, I drew 50% lands here. So it's just very unlucky, and I just could not I was kind of floored by the fact that it just turned out that way. But that's, you know, part of the fun of playing a card game. We move into game 3. Part of the fun of playing a card game is that things like that can happen, and so no win is guaranteed to you until you've actually won it. So anyway, in game 3, I've got a very keepable hand. And this is my opponent who was asking. He says, I want to see his list. Do you have it published? And I let him know that it'll be on the channel. So hopefully if you're watching, by the way, you can tell me how to correctly interpret your name for starters. And also I appreciated you as an opponent. So hopefully you're enjoying this. Anyway, my opponent doesn't have a turbo fast start here or anything. They do have a Rabble Master, but I can kill this before it even starts generating creatures. So let's go ahead and do that, and then I'll slam Sapphire Medallion. Nice thing about being a blue-red deck is you're pretty insulated against Blood Moon too. Here my opponent Simeon Spirit Guides into a Muxus, and I have Force of Will, and then for my turn I go ahead and Intuition. And of course, you know how this goes, right? I'm holding the AK. Whoop. And I miss a land drop, or I would have drawn 4 more cards there. So my opponent does get to resolve a Bombardiers, but we'll get to it. There it is. And we'll get to it again, as a matter of fact, in a moment. We'll go ahead and AK another time. Name sticker, I'm going to blast. They can hit me with the Bombardiers here, and it's a bummer, but it's just 2 per turn. I'm fine with that. Rather than, however, yeah, so I'm just doing naughty shenanigans over here. And I go ahead and donate to my opponent, and we just go for a fast kill, right? So they go for a Legion War, but I force here. I mean, it doesn't matter, right? This game's super over. I'm just, it's trivial now at this point. So we'll just AK again. What was that, the 5th one this game, I think? 5th or 6th time? We'll go ahead and recur the AK and jump up to 51 life against Goblins, which I believe is a pretty good life total to have against the Goblin deck. And finally, my opponent lets the illusions go. He was under no illusions that he was going to win this game, and concedes and says he wants to see the list. I said, you know, sure, of course. So yeah, pretty nice to finish your control deck at 51 against against Goblins, right? So anyway, because it's not really a control deck, it's a combo deck. It's a combo control. All right, and then I get crushed by Pitober here. I win a few more, I lose, I win a few more, and then I go on this like kind of win, you know, loss, win, loss, and then I finally give it up. And what I realized, the reason that I'm finally, this whole thing is just an introduction to deck number 2. What I realized was that I was losing because, for the most part, first of all, the deck's not constructed as well as it could be. That is a thing that needs to change if this deck is going to continue to be played. Secondly, I just didn't build it as well as I could. Secondly, by the way, I don't necessarily love Meltdown. Before I lose that thought, because I think Null Rod makes more sense because you don't want to be melting down your Sapphire Medallions. Anyway, so I don't think it's constructed as well as it could be, but also the problem is that hate for graveyards is mandatory in the format, and it really punishes the deck, and it makes the deck much harder to win. I mean, you do have this and this to win, and of course you can still use Intuition as Demonic Tutor, Blue Demonic Tutor, to put together, you know, to just grab your 1 illusions and your 1 donate against a deck that isn't likely to have interaction to stop you. But you don't always have time, and depending on the kind of hate you're facing, you might be dead before any of that happens. And losing access to your accumulated knowledge, which is really like one of the main engines that runs this deck, is pretty devastating. The other problem is that if opponents do know what they need to do, which is to destroy the Sapphire Medallions, it gets a lot harder. Or if they're attacking your mana, it gets a lot harder. So I felt like basically the deck was extremely good and could win. Extremely good might be an exaggeration. The deck is strong and can win, but it wins slowly. And it was like, I don't really think that it makes sense to try to win slowly when you could win quickly. And the number one deck that gave this problems is the one that I actually switched to. And the reason that I say this is constructed poorly is because this deck currently isn't using a card that in hindsight I realize is absolutely insane. First of all, because of the interaction with Mystic Sanctuary, and second of all, because of the interaction with the format. It's a fast format where people are spending a lot of mana every turn, and the number one card this deck is not using that it should be is in this deck, and that card is Daze. This card is nuts. Daze is so good in a format that's so mana tight, and I think that if I redo Trix, I'm going to be running 3 to 4 Dazes, because it's just Force of Wills that has card advantage when you use Daze to counter another Force of Will, right? So super, super good. The other cards that I wasn't using that I probably should have been running some number of is Echoing Truth, because if you are facing someone who brings in a card like Leyline of the Void or whatever, one Echoing Truth will take care of all of them in a single shot, and all of Urza's Saga creatures and a bunch of other problems. So let's switch gears. That's Trix. Now Reanimator. So why do I like this deck? Well, this deck is pretty unfair, and it takes advantage of a lot of problem cards in the format, and a lot of cards that are intended to be sideboard strategies against the format. It gets to run them, so you're pre-sideboarded against other legacy decks when you play this deck. And those cards include the number one creature, which is Orcish Bowmasters, basically the top dog of creatures in legacy format, or most formats that this card exists in. Alongside the other top dog, I guess, they're competing, Grief. Grief is just a totally nuts card. I probably don't have to explain why it's so crazy, but it's a little bit weird for an old school player like me, because I don't like 2-for-1ing myself. Ironically, given that I'm also running Force of Wills, I don't like 2-for-1ing myself. And there's a card called Unmask that does all the same stuff that Grief does. And so the question is, why is Grief so much better than Unmask? Because Unmask's been around forever, and that was not dominating formats the way that Grief is. And the difference really is that when you put it on a body like they did here, you get a couple different things going on that just make it so much stronger. And the first is, if you have any way to recur that body, like for example Reanimate it, suddenly getting the second trigger makes this so much stronger, because now if you Grief pitching like a Troll of Khazad-dûm and then Reanimate the Grief on turn 1, you're losing your losing your worst black creature, your worst black card. So whatever you pitch to Grief is going to be the worst black card in your hand for the way that your hand is set up at that time. And you're going to be taking their best card. So you're trading your worst card for their best card. And then you're throwing a Grief in the graveyard, who pops back out with a Reanimate, who then takes their second best card. And then when dust is settled, you've lost your worst card, which is in exile. You've lost your Reanimate, which is in your graveyard. And they have lost their 2 best cards, and they're facing a threat. So you're actually ahead. You've basically cast a 0 mana 3/2 unblockable while double duressing them, double thought seizing them. It's really, really gross. It gets even more ridiculous if you do that off a first turn Underground Sea, and your opponent happens to Force a Will at any point in there, and you Daze. It's backbreaking. It is turn 1 concede worthy. If you go first turn Underground Sea and you pitch Troll of Khazad-dûm to Grief, and your opponent like Force a Wills, and you tap black in response and then Daze that Force a Will, they're down 2 cards, and then they get griefed, and then you Reanimate it and they get griefed, and they have no hand at all, and the game just ends. But if they don't, and you have that same start, let's say they don't, well then you grief them, and you get to craft how their hand is going to play out, knowing you have a Daze in your hand and you have an island in play. And it's just so utterly difficult to do anything about that kind of a start. The card gets even more insane when you pair it with a card that's good against you and a good against a format, good against a card like Accumulated Knowledge, which is, I see it in some main deck Reanimator builds, but usually not the majority. I see it in the minority, and typically I don't see it. I might only see it in their sideboard, or there's only like a little representation of the card, not a lot. And that card is Dauthi Voidwalker. So Dauthi Voidwalker preventing your opponent from getting a graveyard is good against so many decks. Obviously, it's extremely good in the mirror. It's really good against nobody's playing AK, so I'm not going to list that as a realistic reason that it's good. But it's extremely good against Life from the Loam decks, Uro decks, which are usually Life from the Loam decks to an extent as well. It's extremely good against Gaia's will decks, like the Storm that tries to combo off with that. It can be good against other, like there's splash damage here and there, but also combos with Grief. You know, like how does this card combo with Grief? Well, you can play turn 2 Douthie Voidwalker often with a Daze ready to go, right? Another like nasty setup is like turn 1 Ponder, turn 2 Douthie Voidwalker with a Daze, and then after it's in play, you Grief them. And when you Grief them, if they have anything good in their hand whatsoever, that card gets exiled. And if they don't kill Douthie Voidwalker like right now, then you get to tap, as soon as it no longer has Summoning Sickness on your next turn, you get to sacrifice it and cast, you know, like did you take a Prime Time out of their hand? Did you take an Eldrazi out of their hand? Did you take like an Omniscience out of their hand? You get to cast the thing. So it lets you reanimate spells like Omniscience or whatever alongside nasty threats. And of course it's really good against somebody trying to do stuff like this. So really sweet combo, pre-sideboards you for the mirror, and essentially operates like having Animate Dead's 6 through 10, in the sense that you're going to be reanimating their stuff with the Douthie Voidwalkers. Of course, Bowmasters is format dominating, probably doesn't require a lot of talking, but in here, it's not only is it a really good card that you can punish, you know, Brainstorm and Ponder decks with, but it's also, and of course small creatures, but it's also a card that you can sometimes trade off like for an advantage, and then just reanimate trivially and continue to, and you can just harass the hell out of somebody with Bowmasters and Voidwalkers coming back into play again and again, along with possibly Griefs, and Troll of Khazad-dûm, who's just, it's just so much, like if you look at Trix, right, we were doing some really cool stuff with Lorien Revealed, tutoring for Mystic Sanctuaries and comboing up with our Brainstorms and stuff. We get that same general effect over here, except with Troll, we get to go first turn, cycle the Troll basically, and now we're all set for turn 2 Reanimate or Animate Dead, which is gnarly. So like you get a start sometimes where you just go first turn, Underground Sea or whatever, you know, first turn, you go first turn Wasteland, right, and pass, and then you end of turn cycle Troll, and you grab yourself an Underground Sea, and then on turn 2 you play Underground Sea, you Wasteland them, and then you use the Underground Sea to reanimate Troll, and now they have a 6/5 that can't be blocked. And like, sure, they might go land Plowshares, and then the game gets to continue, and that's assuming you don't have a Daze or a Force or whatever, or you haven't griefed it out of their hand. So maybe the game continues, but maybe the game doesn't, because if they don't have something real quick, a 6/5 ends the game in a big hurry, and it's pretty hard to like race that, as well as very hard to kind of combo off in the face of a deck that's loaded with draw hate, discard hate, graveyard hate, hand destruction, and free counter magic, right? Super hard when you're getting, like, you'd like to wait for the optimal time to go off, but if you're getting hit for 6 per turn, the optimal time may never come. As well as all that, we have the total scam like stuff of just entombing something disgusting like Archon of Cruelty or Atraxa, reanimating or animate deading that thing, and then now like Archon of Cruelty is the ideal target because you Disrupting Scepter them and Jam Day Tome yourself, as well as Edict them and Drain Life them for 3, and you just keep doing that. It's completely unbeatable, but occasionally you're just super low on cards because like you go early Grief, end of turn Entomb, Force of Will their play, and then Reanimate. And in a case like that, where you have that kind of hand that sequences that way, you go get Atraxa instead, because Atraxa, looking at 10 cards and putting a card of each type, this deck can potentially put somewhere around like 5 to 6 cards in its hand, but usually it gets like 4, so 4 to 6. I think it's 6. 4 to 5. Let's just say 4 to 5, because you get a creature. The deck has creatures, instants, sorceries. It has enchantments. It has land. 5. if you don't hit one of the enchantments, you get 4. So this one just immediately gets you 4 cards. But it's 4 of your choice from among 10, and that typically means you're going to grab yourself a Force of Will, you're going to grab yourself another Reanimate effect, you're going to get yourself potentially another opportunity to combo off, and you'll just do the same exact thing with Archon again. But even if you don't, you'll get like a Grief or a Bowmasters, and then you'll be attacking their hand while following up. Like you have a big play and a follow-up with constant aggression that disrupts them. It's just too much. So the deck is savage, very, very good. You have to be a little bit creative if you're facing the mirror, because you have to deal with, you have to be careful about, one of the things that you can set yourself up for is like you think, hey, I'm going to Voidwalker in the mirror, and then there's no way that they can animate anything and I'm going to beat them, but they can animate your stuff too, so you've got to be very careful about that. Of course, if you do Voidwalker your opponent and then Grief like one of their fatties, they're just toast, right? Because if they can't kill the Voidwalker, and they usually can't because they would need like double Bowmasters to do it. There's no hope for them at that point, unless they happen to have, some decks do play a little bounce, some decks do play a little removal. I think most of the decks play a single copy of Brazen Borrower, but I felt like the chances that a single Brazen Borrower is going to save me versus just being more consistent didn't make as much sense to me. So anyway, sideboarding, we get the 3 Blue Blasts set up the same way. And then Null Rod, same as the other deck. Echoing Truth, same reasoning as the other deck, which, this would have been Pyroclasm, but basically we want to be able to bounce any problem permanents. If my opponent brings in Leyline in the Void, we bounce them all. If they bring in Grafdigger's Cage, it's the same thing, Rest in Peace, whatever. We can just Echoing Truth all of them in one shot. But it also takes care of Urza Saga tokens. It also takes care of like all of them in one shot. It also takes care of, if my opponent gets a really fast start with Mox Diamonds, you can just punish the hell out of them with an Echoing Truth. There's just a lot of, or Chrome Moxes. There's just a lot of things that Truth is extremely good at doing. And one of the ways that you can sideboard this deck, because the black cards are so aggressive, is that you can actually, if you're pretty confident that they're going to be attacking your graveyard and you just not super worried about it, and I sideboard like this all the time, what you do is you take out the 4 Entombs and the 2 Fatties. You just take this package out here if you don't need it, and then you'll typically bring in something like triple Echoing Truth, and then say they're playing a red deck, or you just bring in this, and then you just beat them with it. Well, if they're playing a red deck, you probably leave the package in, but let's say they're playing like a blue, like a blue-based combo deck, right? So then you just bring in your Null Rods and your Echoing Truths. Or if they're not playing like a blue-based, if they're not playing like a Goblins Storm deck, then you bring in your Damping Spheres and your Null Rods like that. Something along those lines, right? And you don't even worry about the Reanimate stuff much at all. So, the deck sideboards very well and can happily sideboard out of the Reanimation package and just win games regardless. Because a lot of decks are the kind of decks like Doomsday and stuff where their game plan requires them to successfully execute their combo, and if they can't win, because they can't stop you. You can kill them with a 1/1 Bowmaster token. If they can't actually go off, they just die. Doomsday is the most extreme example because they literally deck themselves if they don't go off. If they actually resolve a Doomsday and don't beat you, it's Doomsday for them, right? So, but the other part of the sideboard here is Dystopia. If you've never seen it before, cumulative upkeep of a life. Beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices a green or white permanent. You typically will want to cut, but not always, will want to cut Atraxa when you bring this in, because it will force you to sacrifice Atraxa. It's the only thing that it fights with in here. But not always do you necessarily need to cut Atraxa, and one of the reasons for that is Atraxa can find it very well. And if you do sacrifice it after you've Atraxa, you almost certainly have another Reanimate effect, which allows you to then reanimate Atraxa and draw like 10 more cards. So you can actually use it as a card drawing engine. It's not the worst thing in the world. So it's not something to like worry about. It's just something to be aware of. Dystopia is super, super savage though. It kills all of their Carpet of Flowers. It kills all of their Up the Beanstalks. It kills all of their Stoneforged Mystics. It kills all of their Rest in Peace. It kills so it basically hoses their sideboard. You know, their islands don't untap, choke, right, and all this crap. So it kills all that stuff completely. Dorks, like, it's a nasty card for like White Weenie to have to deal with, which can be a problematic deck to face. It just, you know, it obviously if they're playing elves or anything like that. So basically all the really good sideboard cards, except for the green instant that prevents that works, that allows them to draw a card when you have played a blue or black card. I forgot what the name is. Other than that card, basically the majority of sideboard cards that you'll see come in against you are either going to be graveyard hate cards, which you can Echoing Truth, or they're going to be attacking the blue and black side of your deck, and then Dystopia handles those cards very, very well. There's no specific reason for running in threes here. We're not running intuitions, other than the fact that you frequently sideboard out exactly 6 cards, like I said. You sideboard out this all the time, is your cut. At other times, if you're not cutting that, you can actually do something a little bit different. Like, for example, you may sideboard out these right here. Just sideboard these out, and your deck looks, you leave the rest of this in there, and you just take those out, and you bring in your 6 that way. Bowmasters aren't good against everyone. They're good against everyone, but they're not great against everyone, and we want to go to great for all of our slots if we can in game 2. So we may just not need them in game 2. And so if against White Weenie, on the other hand, Bowmasters are still usually pretty good. So what you do is you just take out your Animates and your Void Walkers, and you just run your Dystopias and your Echoing Truths. Unless you think that you need to make other adjustments. You can sideboard even harder against them. You could leave your Bowmasters and Void Walkers. You could cut your Entombs, leave your 2 Animates, cut your Atraxa and Cruelty, bring in your Dystopias and your Null Rods if they're playing Aether Vials, for example. So it's just, you've got room, but it all kind of works out when you're sideboarding. And the deck is just absolutely savage. I've played around with it. The configuration so far, this is the one I'm settling on. It's a lot closer to, like, it's pretty much where it needs to be. I would probably need some feedback or more experience to understand what changes need to be made from here. I am doing something a little bit different with my mana base, in the sense that I'm running 6 fetches, basic, Undercity, 4 Underground Seas, and the majority of decks of this caliber, of this nature, all run 3 Wastelands. I'm running 2 in an Urborg, and it's like, I don't really like the Urborg, but I don't like giving my opponent black mana and helping them potentially. But on the flip side, I have Douthy's main deck, and most people don't, and the ability to play a island, cast Ponder, and then turn 2 play Urborg and cast a Douthie Voidwalker, and then daze with that basic island is too important, I think, not to have access to the one Urborg. In the Wastelands, it's just not that important to be attacking their mana. They're just in there for a couple of problems like that you might encounter, like a little defense against Dark Depths and a little defense against like a Tabernacle, or things like that, things of that nature that you might want to get off the board. Or if you see a window of opportunity where you can strategically wasteland in order to ensure that a daze is going to be potent, like if they leave a mana up at the end of their turn, on your turn you waste them and then you make your plays with a daze in your hand. That's the kind of use for wasteland that this deck wants to be using. It's not here to like mana screw them, it's here to strategically remove mana at opportune moments. Not like completely just suppress them and win the game with the wasteland effects. And often like if I have an Urborg out and a wasteland, often having 2 black is more valuable to me than giving one of my lands up to mess with my opponent. When you compare the power level, what this deck's doing to what the opponents are doing, what you find frequently is that whatever you're trying to do is generally better, more powerful than what they're trying to do anyway. So making it harder for you to do your job in order to make it harder for them to do their job is actually a net gain for them, because their job means less than your job means. Like if you can get an Archon of Cruelty into play, who cares if they haven't up the beanstalk, right? So that's as an example. So maybe don't wasteland their blue-green land instead just get your combo going, that kind of thing. So why Damping Sphere, I guess, might be your question. Damping Sphere is specifically in here for Ancient Tombs, City of Traders, all that kind of stuff, all that nonsense. But at the same time, just to make sure, because it's very hard to daze anything when their lands all produce multiple manas, 8 post, stuff like that. And then in addition to that, Damping Sphere is also really good at, for the storm decks, of course. And it does hurt you a little bit, but often the case is that you've already dumped your hand and then you play Damping Sphere and you're sitting on like a Force of Will, and it's really a comfort if they tap out then to make a play and you Force of Will it, and they even have a Force of Will. Damping Sphere actually forces Force of Will to become a defensive card and not an offensive card. And what I mean by that is that you can use Force of Will offensively. Like I can go Reanimate Archon of Cruelty, and then my opponent goes in response Dress Down, and I'm like Force of Will or something. I don't know. Maybe they Force of Will and I have Force of Will back. And I'm using it offensively to ram home a winning condition. But Damping Sphere makes that really hard. So because I play my win cons super early, it generally punishes, if I'm bringing it in against an opponent, because I'm expecting it's going to punish them harder than me. It's going to make it so that any Force of Wills they have to try to protect their combo are unplayable for them. So it's like a mini Trinisphere kind of thing. So anyway, that's it. I'm going to run through some games and then we'll call it a video. This has been a very long video because it's a twofer, but I figured it made just more sense to, run through it. And here you can see, like, over the last, I don't know, from the 23rd, I guess, we can kind of look at the win rate here. We've had, what is this? Especially more recently, as I've gotten better at piloting the deck, you can see, I can't remember if I was still playing the old one or if this loss against Nick 88 was with the Reanimator deck, but it's preceded by even more wins and then these couple losses here. I'm pretty sure somewhere around here, maybe Super Buds when I stopped playing the old one. I can't remember. But I'll just pick up from after that, whatever. We'll start off with, I guess, the loss against Nick and see if that was with the Reanimator deck. And then every game after that's been a win. And this was a 1-2. And we'll see if there was any specific reason, if we can suss out why. Yeah, so this is with the Reanimator deck. So he beats me in this match, and then after that I just go on to win all the rest of the matches that I play. So we'll see what happens. Opponent leads off with Scalding Tarn here, and obviously I don't have a Force of Will, but I have a Brainstorm to potentially find one, and I have Reanimate Troll, plus I have Entomb Troll. My opponent goes for Hushbringer. I Brainstorm in response, because I can still Entomb Reanimate here. Hushbringer causes creatures to enter the battlefield without triggering their abilities, so it kind of sucks for the Archon plan, but I'm thinking I might be able to get that off the board with a Bowmasters. Opponent has a Wasteland here, so instead I just play the Bowmasters aggressively, and then, oh right, it doesn't actually trigger unless they actually draw some cards. Okay, I guess that's alright. I try to waste them here and they have a Stifle. Just not great. I do have a Force of Will though, so maybe I can do something. They're down to 4 cards in hand. I'm down to, we've had, a land die every turn. I go ahead and tutor up an Archon of Cruelty. Opponent goes for Prismatic Ending. Yeah, I'm not going to fight over that either. And then, yeah, I'm just going for Reanimate on Archon. And it lands. So probably my opponent has a Plow. I'm going to try to force to see if I can win. Opponent cycles Lorien, plays Hedge Maze, and Archon lives. Uh-oh. Let's swing. Go ahead and play a land there. And use Undercity Sewers, mill off a Polluted Delta. Boom. Gain some life, draw a card, kill their creature. It takes a Force of Will out of their hand. Very, very nice. I'll go ahead and Ponder here. I've got to find another. I find another Reanimate with an Entomb underneath it. Opponent goes for 4 mana to replay Uro, and I get to daze that, and then from there because Escape is not putting it into play, it's actually casting it from the graveyard, which means I can counter and interact with it. So I go ahead and just stays there, and then they scoop. I mean, they're dead anyway, basically, because this hits for 9. So they're at 1. So as you can see, this deck plays very well on almost no mana at all. Contrast to, the AK deck. I had Leylines in my deck, and I sideboarded them in because of the Uro, and this was just wrong. And also, I don't know why did I even keep this hand? This hand is atrocious. Wasteland my opponent there. I don't know what I'm doing here. I definitely don't know what I'm doing here. Clearly don't know what I'm doing here. Me today watching this doesn't know what me back then was doing here, and me back then definitely didn't know what he was doing. So, and my opponent runs out of Dreadnought, stifles it. I'm going to try to force, of course. They force back, I believe. No, the Dreadnought dies. Okay, gets exiled. I faded the 12/12 for a turn. Still have no play. I'm still just desperately strip wastelanding, just hoping that maybe it'll do something. Opponent's pondering. I'm sad that I wasted the Tundra. When I killed a tropical first, it would have been better to kill a tropical second, basically. I draw Entomb. This is just a frustrating game, right? Leyline's so bad in my sideboard. I've obviously cut those because I'm running Douthies. I don't need them. Opponent Days here. I'm happy to see that go because I just want to draw a blue. Can I just draw a blue? I had a single copy of Deep Analysis floating between my main deck and sideboard, and the reason was so that I could Entomb for it. I cut that. It's just kind of gimmicky. It works. It's good. It's not horrible, but it's also not necessary. Really what's necessary is drawing a blue here. What a terrible feeling. Hushbringers, of course, will stop the Phyrexian Dreadnought triggers. So here we are on turn 7, and I still haven't drawn a single source of blue mana. So here we are on turn 8, and I haven't drawn a source of blue mana. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and, I even just watching is just that was just awful. So we'll move on to game 3. And I think this is where I realized that Leyline sucked and I needed to make some changes. I think it was after this, but anyway. So I brought in Dystopias, of course. I have Animates here. I decided to keep the Animate because I've got Troll. I can put something together here pretty quick. Permanent Surgical's Ponder, which sadly means that I lose the Ponder in my hand, which sucked, but I didn't want to throw away the Force of Will. I do find a Wasteland here. Alright. I'm planning to troll them, so I don't need to have a black mana and play this turn. So we'll go ahead and cycle here. And we'll grab the Underground Sea and go ahead and reanimate the troll. Do they have another Surgical? They don't. Interesting. So I've got a 5/5. So that's definitely a clock. A Dreadnought Stifle. But that's more of a clock. And because they hit on the Ponder earlier, everything just works out perfectly for them here. I got nothing. And I had stupid Leylines in my deck instead of... I don't even have Bounce. I don't have Echoing Truths. So I can't even... There's literally 0 ways in this version of the deck to deal with that 12/12 other than stopping it from coming into play. I'm just going to hard cast a Daze on this. No, I cast Daze using Undercity Sewers to try to take a look at another card. But it doesn't matter if you look at another card. I just get to look at the Brainstorm before I die. And die I do. So that's how I lost with this deck. So now let's get into the wins, because that was the last loss. What was that, here? And it felt pretty fluky. But I did make some adjustments. I don't remember if I made them immediately after that or what. But obviously... later have got the Douthies in, and my win rate just shot up after making that change. Alright, this is a Yorion Aether Vial deck, and I Force a Will the Aether Vial with Ponder, thinking that it's just going to generate way too much mana for them. It'll invalidate Daze. It's going to be a problem. However, am I willing to Force a Will twice an Aether Vial? They only have 4 cards in hand? No, I'm not really willing to Force a Will twice. During my upkeep, I could have cycled off the troll. I guess I chose not to because I had animate dead on top. So I go ahead and cycle now, and we'll go ahead and animate that guy. Alright, and I'm hoping my opponent end step plows me and then I can just daze it, was what I would have liked to have seen happen there. Instead they plow here. I'm going to go ahead and try to protect it though. It wasteland me. Sucks, but I've invested enough in this that I don't feel like there's a good opportunity for me here if I don't actually get the win in. Let's see, before I mill off Archon right there, which is huge. So I was thinking about griefing, but I play my land first and hit an Archon with it. Just so incredibly good there. So it gives me the information not to use the grief. Opponent takes up Aether Vial, gets a Caracas, doesn't do anything to Archon, does mess with the green white blue flyer, green white blue black flyer, but here I just get to reanimate Archon, and yeah, my opponent concedes. So there's game one. Game two I lose, and then I don't think I'm losing much of anything after this. It might be a game somewhere in the next few sets. But that's it. Of course, I bring in the Null Rods against them. They bring in Grafdigger's Cage. And you can guess what kind of hand. I did not sideboard correctly. Remember how I was saying to sideboard out the combo pieces? I did not, and now I'm drawing nothing but combo pieces. And I'm going to spare us some waste of time, but they get Thalia, which is just mildly annoying for this deck. It's not generally backbreaking like it is for other decks. But the bottom line is, I don't have a deck. There's nothing I can do against this. I sideboarded completely wrong, and I just keep drawing like dead, 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 dead. I literally have a 6-drop I'm supposed to win the game with. It's not going to work. So we just move on to game 3. And here I've got a little bit better stuff going on. I've sideboarded correctly now. I grief them right off the bat. I think I have. And because of the way that I stack the abilities, of course, I get to grief them, reanimate grief. And at this point, I leave them with port. What did I take? Swords and extraction. Yeah, so ephemerate, canoptic, port. So, yeah, so their hand looks like this. And we'll check them off as we go. Port's down, plains is down. So they have ephemerate, canoptic, and a Yorion in their sideboard. But I'm continuing to pressure them and develop. I protect. And they finally get a Mother of Runes out and they port me here. But in response, ping. So now they're down to just ephemerate and canoptic. Canoptic is the sideboard card that everyone seems to be pumped about. They do find a plow, so I gain 6 life. And then port me, where I get to brainstorm in response. You can see I was trying out Brazen Borrower, which is now Echoing Truth. Here, Brazen Borrower is fine. But I'm just going to actually apply additional pressure against them. And just try to finish them off. They get a Stoneforge into Batterskull, so their hand is Ephemerate, Canoptic, Batterskull. And off the top, Dystopia. So I'm going to go ahead and just pass. And now they have to use this with Dystopia on the stack to get their Batterskull down. They could ephemerate here, but they would still have to sack their Stoneforge. If I was them, I might have ephemerated just to blink. But I'm going to just pay 1 life and keep that Abyss for my opponent into play. In play, rather. This would have been Echoing Truth, so it would have accomplished the same thing. And I end up... I was using 2 Echoing Truths and 1 Brazen Borrower, but I kind of like just having 3 Echoing Truths, to be honest. So I bounce that thing. I bounce the token, leave them with the Batterskull, and smash them down to 3. Opponent has to then sack a white permanent. They don't have any, of course. But what do they do here? They play a Canoptic Swarm. It's like, okay, sure, you get a nothing. It exiles my graveyard, and for each artifact or land card, they get a creature, but there were no artifacts, nor were there any lands. I'll go ahead and just pay some life here, keep that in play, and they're at 3, so it's kind of deterministic at this point. I don't think white has Force of Wills that they snuck into their deck, and even if they did, they only have an Ephemerate in hand. So we'll go ahead and bounce that. I swing, I'm going to bounce, and they're going to die. And so I think that was games 1 and 3, I believe. All right. And then as for the rest, BDP Steve. You can see how just like oppressive Dystopia is. Wonderfully oppressive. Old school card I see in nobody's sideboard. Absolutely love it. Another opponent playing Yorion, and I mulligan. Wasn't my first hand, just didn't feel like it had enough action. And mulligan into this. So I've got an Entomb, but I have no Reanimate effect. I think at the time I was running, I can't remember, for a couple of these I don't have the complete Douthie package, which is why probably why we haven't seen them yet, but maybe I could be wrong about that. I do top deck and Animate Dead though, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. So another mono white player, so they Mystic into Lion Sash, which is really interesting. But at the end of their turn, I'm not super worried about that because we're just going to Entomb Archon, cycle off a Troll, so we can hit some mana and, Surveil. And then, fine. Like I said, I was running one main deck Brazen Borrower. Well, get rid of that Grief. I don't think I need that. Animate the Archon, kill that thing. Cool, they have and I have double Force of Will. So we're just going to Force here and then Force again if we need to, and that game 1 is over. Game 2, this is not the same opponent, by the way, but it is roughly the same sideboarding decisions. Okay. So again, here I bring in I take out the tutor package, and I go ahead and first turn Grief my opponent. And you can see they have an Aether Vial here. They've got a Rest in Peace, but the Rest in Peace, it's too late, right? So I Grief them. I'm going to take more than likely Plow, and then I'm going to Reanimate the Grief, and I'm going to take one of these other cards here, and I'm probably not going to worry about Rest in Peace. They can have it. More than likely, I guess I would take Recruiter of the Guard and just leave them with the Skyclaves, probably. Hard to say. I think that's probably makes the most sense, though. I suppose I could go Plow, Rest in Peace, or whatever, but regardless, they're kind of in a bad spot. Before they get to 3, I'm going to Brazen Borrower the Aether Vial and force them to start over on the timer. And that's if I don't find a Null Rod. So in the face of Grief Scam, where I'm just Grief Reanimates Grief them, my opponent just concedes and we move on. And I'm facing On Duty Medic. This is what I mean. It's just so hard. Grief is just such a hard card to deal with, particularly when it's reanimated or whatever. This is perfectly fine hand. We're not thrilled by it, but we have double counterspell on turn 1 is always good, and the ability to fix our hand is also good. Opponent Faithless Lootings, Badlands, Verdant Catacombs hit the bin. Glad it wasn't like some madness stuff going on over there. I'm going to go ahead and just Grief away the Atraxa, and I do see madness, actually. Opponent has Wooded Foothills, Basking Rootwater, Putrid Imp, and another Putrid Imp, which is the thing that I take with the Grief, pitching the Atraxa. And so now I know exactly what their hand is. So I Wasteland their Badlands. They play Wooded Foothills, fetch another Badlands, cast a Gamble. I let the Gamble happen, discarding a Putrid Imp. They then crack their Lion's Eye Diamond for red, discarding their 2 Root Wallows, which they get to cast, and then they can cast this Ox of Agonus from their graveyard. And because they have 3 red floating, I can't even daze the thing. And this Ox has an escape cost. Exile 8 of their cards. It escapes with a +1/+1 counter on it. So they're just... It also says discard your hand and draw 3. So if this thing resolves, it's a 5/3 that draws 3 cards for them. So obviously we're not going to let that resolve. But I can't daze it because of the fact that they've got a mana floating. So I'm just going to have to force instead. So I decided that Daze, though, at this point with no Lotus in play, with no Lion's Eye Diamond, Daze is way more valuable than Force of Will with no blue card. So opponents ahead on board, but do we really care particularly? They do hit a Mountaineer, which is an unfortunate thing for me to see. I have 2 Underworld Sewers in this version. I see Orcish Bowmasters, so we'll take that. That'll take care of those guys. Dazing with Undercity Sewers is kind of nice, if I need to do it, or get the opportunity. Yeah, they swing in. Of course, we're just going to Bowmaster here, take care of one and the other. Glad that they didn't draw green, so they can't pump here. It was a risky trick, but worthy. And then for my turn, I cast Doughty Voidwalker, and my opponent concedes. The second Undercity Sewer was actually has become the Urborg, and it was better here, of course, but you know it would have been fine either way. Anyhow, we get the Voidwalker out, and then there's nothing they can do, and so we move on to game 2 because they need their flashback cards and their graveyard cards in order to kind of combo off, and also they have no cards in hand. So, all right, so game 2 is fine, but not great. So I take a mulligan and see a hand that's a little bit more fine. I brought in Hydroblast and stuff. They do get to gamble into a Fiery Temper that they then can't cast as they don't have the mana for it, but they do play an LED, so I just play a land and pass. At the end of their turn, I'm going to Brainstorm. There's the Damping Spheres. But my Undercity Sewer comes into play tapped. It's not a Urborg. I mean, it could have been. It's fine. It mills off one of the Damping Spheres that they don't necessarily need. They're going to go for Taiga into Basking Rootwalla. That's all fine with me. And for my turn, I'm very happy to see a land there. So I'm actually going to play out the Doughty Voidwalker. They Fairy Macabre me twice, crack an LED, and go for a Madness creature who, whenever it attacks, you discard your hand and then draw 3 cards. I'm just going to Hydroblast that thing off the board now. And from there, my opponent gives up. They get no more graveyard. If I need to, I can just replay this and grab 3 cards, like if I get low on cards. And yeah, they use Fairy Macabres, but I mean, does any of that matter at all? Probably not. And then I can get a Damping Sphere down against them, so it'll be extraordinarily difficult for them to play anything with Madness at that point. After on duty Medic, I face Yamizaga, who doesn't want to play a full round, and that is fine. So we just play round 1. I go ahead and do this and put a Bowmaster on top. I don't know what they're playing, but I'm going first, so I figure this is fine. I get the days I can recur that effect if I want to. All right, well, I see blue, and I've got a Bowmasters and double Daze Force. Like, I'm feeling real good about my hand right now. They go for a Hedron Crab. I'm going to go ahead and just daze that, hardcast. My opponent Archive traps me because I searched and then extracts my Atraxa. But I counter their Crab, and then I go ahead and cast a Bowmasters. They Surgical my Trolls in response. Such a weird thing to see happening. This is all in game 1, by the way. No, they're just pre-sideboarded against, because they're trying to play some sort of mill deck. Anyway, on my turn, I just ponder, and my opponent just concedes. I don't like this at all. I don't think this is good at all. Like, it ends up, they know it's in my hand. They know I have Force Daze, right? So now I get to set my hand up even further with Ponder. And obviously, being a Reanimator deck, things get gross. And we know what's coming. I'm going to set up, mill off one of the cards I don't want, and then on the next turn, I'm going to get Voidwalker down. It's just going to be bad for them. And they just want nothing to do with me, so they go ahead and move on to a new opponent, I guess. So I face Spatula of the Ages. This is incidentally the deck I think I'll go ahead and take in when I do my first tournament run in Legacy. I believe I'll be playing this. And I don't know why my opponent concedes her. I don't actually know why. I guess we've played before and they didn't want... Yeah, we hadn't played any time recently, so yeah, I have no clue why my opponent conceded there. Maybe they were waiting for somebody else. We're not going to count that as a win. Anyway, next day, I'm against, on the 24th here, I start out by playing Chunk Buckle. And Chunk Buckle, and I have to take a mulligan in game 1. Of course, this is the pure, this is the exact list, I believe. And I've got a keep, and I actually throw away my Force of Will. And it's not great when you're mulliganing, and I also have a hand that's just all black. And I lead off with Grief here, and my opponent, I remember he makes a comment like, let me guess, you're going to reanimate Grief, and he just concedes because he's probably sick of... Like, it feels really bad playing Legacy and Modern and everywhere that Grief's legal and getting griefed and griefed and griefed and griefed. Like, people are constantly griefing you, and it feels so awful that I don't blame my opponent, but I think that was a little premature. Anyway, next opponent, Sword of Nice and Guy. But you do get free wins with this deck just in testing in that way, but you're not going to get free wins in a tournament that way. You're going to have to play it out most times. But then again, maybe his hand was so fragile that there was no beating it. Anyway, I win the dice roll. My opponent, once upon a time, is into Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. I go ahead and brainstorm and then grief my opponent. And I see a Dark Depths hand, so I take their Elvish Reclaimer. And so this is exactly what their hand is. So they go Yavimaya into Pithing Needle, naming Wasteland. That's rough. This isn't going to be too easy. I'm going to go ahead and just try to craft my hand here with brainstorms and such. I've gotten Entomb, so that's good. Alright, a Glimmer Post comes down. This is an 8 post, obviously. I'm going to go ahead and Entomb into Atraxa. And then I'm going to Ponder. I was fiddling with a one main deck copy of Sabo's Web. And I go ahead and reanimate, or I go ahead and Undercity Sewers, seeing a reanimate. My opponent hits an Elvish Reclaimer, which is bad news for me. I'm going to go ahead and reanimate Atraxa. And from these cards, I end up selecting Ponder, Land, Douthie, Animate, and Tomb. So pretty good stuff. And because I get an Entomb here and I have an Animate, I'm going to go ahead and set up a Voidwalker for now. And I think my opponent says something sarcastic, maybe, but I can't tell because it's text. They say, hey, I've been hearing about this deck. I've been wanting to see it in action for a long time. Well, if you play Legacy, you're going to see this deck in action constantly. My opponent fetches for a Bojuka Bog and counters my Animate Dead. But I still have an Atraxa and a Douthie Voidwalker beating them down. So there is that. I also get to exile their Yavimaya, Cradle of whatever. So they've got Dark Depths now, and at this point, I'm trying to beat them down, but you know they can get a 20-20 here, and bad things can happen. So I go for a Sabo's Web, which was, like I said, in my main deck, which is a little bit of a funky one. So they do their Dark Depths combo, but I go for Grief. They set up for their Dark Depths combo, but I'm hard casting a Grief, I think. Or no, I'm evoking a Grief. But the problem is for them that they're going to get a 20-20 who can attack and take me to 2, but they can't make this thing ever get... This things will never be able to get through for damage. And what's going to happen is that I'm going to hit them with my Voidwalkers who can't be blocked and take my opponent down to 8 here. And if they hit me for 20, then I'm going to attack back. I'm going to crack back for 3, 6, for 12 and kill my opponent. So if they don't attack at all, like, oh, this is Summoning Sick, I'm not going to hit them for that. So they're at 11. So basically they're going to get a Merit Lage, and then they attack me for 20, and I go to 2, and then I attack them for 12, unblockable, and they die, is what's going to happen. Maybe a little bit more with Bowmasters. So this is the problem that they're running into. They have Glacial Chasm in their hand, but which means that they should be able to work around it. So I really don't actually understand why they handled this the way that they handled it. I felt like they had won the game, but at any rate, we move into game 2, and now I get the sideboard solutions against them, and it's going to be a lot harder for them to win now. So I've got they've got Pithing Needle and Grief again. I get to Grief them, or on Wasteland again, I get to Grief them for a Green Sun Zenith, leave them with these cards in hand. I then Ponder. I have Entomb, and I don't have a reanimation effect anyway right now. They do get a land down, and they burn there Once Upon a Time, I believe. Oh no, because they use Pithing Needle. They can't burn there Once Upon a Time. So I'm just setting up here with I draw an Entomb, so I do the Entomb reanimated Atraxa thing. And my opponent off the top pulls a Caracas. Gnarly. Painful too. So for my turn, I'm going to run out Dystopia. Now they get the hard cast Once Upon a Time. I'm going to daze that, just because I have an opportunity to daze, and I'm going to disrupt them. And with Dystopia down, they can use Elvish Reclaimer now, and they do, to go get a Cloud Post, but Elvish Reclaimer's gone. They then play a Tabernacle, and now you get to see how good Dystopia actually is. So I'm going to pay some life here, obviously. And then I'm going to run out a Doughty Voidwalker, run a Ponder. Probably did that in the wrong order. Find myself a Troll, which will help me hit land drops. And pass. Alright, so my opponent has to sacrifice in theory, but of course they don't have anything. They have a Thespian Sage. We're a little bit worried about Dark Depths because they've got the Needle on Wasteland, but we have Echoing Truth, so we're worried, we're concerned, but we're aware, but not worried, I guess, terribly. I go ahead and just pay the 2 life there. I want to stall for a little bit longer, so I'll just leave the Dystopia in play. And attack. And I know that their hand doesn't really contain much, so I'm not griefing them here. They make a copy of Cloudpost and then use Eye of Ugin. I'm going to brainstorm, and then they hardcast on their turn Primetime, which is just such a gift. I'm going to brainstorm in response and then force that sucker right into the zone where I want it to be, under the Doughty Voidwalker. And now you can see how gnarly this is. So now I want that Primetime in play on my side, so I'm going to let the Dystopia go. And then I'm going to sack Doughty rather than paying the 1 mana to Tabernacle. And then I'm going to go ahead and draw naturally and cast Primetime. And that will grab me double Wasteland. I'll then reanimate the Doughty and pass for the turn. So things are looking pretty grim for my opponent here because they had a Primeval Titan. They do get a Dark Depths here, which I'm just going to ignore for the moment and bounce that Pithing Needle. So they use their Thespian Sage to copy Dark Depths. They make a 20/20. Pithing Needle goes away because they know they don't want a double Wasteland in play against them is going to be a problem. I'm going to go ahead and just pay my upkeep for the 2 creatures that I have. And Wasteland all of their green, kill their Cloudpost. I don't even care about the other stuff. Bounce their 20/20, and let's get in there. And I don't have any more Wastelands to go fetch, but I can get an Undercity Sewers. I'm not going to get Urborg and help them out. Don't need a Daze, so we'll get rid of that. Mash for 9. My opponent now has a Tabernacle, an Eye, neither of which tap for mana, and a singular Caracas that I just completely ignore. My opponent says... So my opponent was kind of, I think, making a joke, and they said, well, yeah, they'd never played this deck. And I said, well, I'm not really playing a standard version, I don't think. And then my opponent says, yeah, you got some crazy cards in it, LOL. And I said, or that's when I said, yeah, I don't think I'm a standard version, but yeah, those crazy cards are just planning experience kicking in, allowing me to win some pretty wild games here as I switched into a combo control deck with an emphasis on control rather than being an emphasis on combo. So Sword of Nicing guy packs it up, and we move into the next game against Derek. Poor Reek. A lot of interesting names here that I ran into in this Legacy lobby. Anyway, so my opponent leads off with Flooded Strand. I have a keep. I mean, it's a turn 2 big guy and a turn 1 Brainstorm to try to get a Daze or a Force to back it up, or a Grief. I was wondering 1 copy of Foil. So the reasoning behind this, the way this card works is you can discard an island and another card to force a will. And the reasoning behind this was that sometimes I would get stuck with the big guys in my hand. Now, as it turns out, you don't need it because you can just Brainstorm them away, or use Pitch them to Grief or whatever. You can always find a way to use them. So you just don't need the foil. But I didn't realize that at the time, and I figured I'd have an extra Force of Will effect, which couldn't be bad. So we'll see if I even use it here, but that was the thought behind it. Also, because of Daze in the deck, the ability to just Daze, pick up an island, and then Force with it using foil seemed pretty good. But I don't necessarily recommend it. It's an interesting piece of tech, but it's not necessarily a good one. Alright, so I grab my Atraxa, and I do have foil available here, but do I want to fight a war over Atraxa now, or do I want to wait until I can grief them? Do I want to set up a little bit longer? I mean, they look like they're control, and I'm in no real rush and under no real pressure. So I'm going to just keep brainstorming and making my hand stronger and stronger, cycling into more hitting my land drops and everything. Find Douthie Voidwalker. That's a card that they're probably willing to fight over, and I'm not. So I'm really happy to use it as a bait spell here. I mean, if they don't fight over it, it's probably eating Plow, which is good also, right? And if none of those things happen, then they can't win a counter war if Douthie Voidwalker is active very easily, because I can always crack it and counter. So it does eat a prismatic ending, not a Plow. But that is fine, because we've had enough time to set up that I can actually start going for the Atraxa play. Now they have very little mana available to them. I'll go ahead and animate Atraxa here. They force. I just let it go. I animate again. It sticks. With removal on the stack, I'm going to go ahead and just let it go. And whoop, fill up my hand with Entomb, Reanimate, Grief, Wasteland. Opponent goes ahead and recurs Ponder and plays a Narset. Doesn't matter to me. I'm not really drawing extra cards here much. And the thing that I intend to put into play next turn does not care much about Narset either. Alright, from here I'm going to hardcast Grief. They have 2 cards in hand. So I'm just peeking to make sure that the coast is clear. I'll get around to Entomb, whatever, in a minute. They grab a Swords to Plowshares there and then tutor. They have to show me the card they get with Narset. So I don't know what Ponder found, but I do know the rest of what's in their hand. They go for a Predict, so I decided that actually they probably have... I still have a counter available, so they probably have too many cards in hand. I don't want to mess with it. I'm going to Entomb End Step for Grief here. And then, because I knew I had the foil, we'll go ahead and attack Narset, get that off the board. Just because I want to be sure that I can draw extra cards in case the Archon somehow doesn't go right. But it does. It resolves. We take a card out of their hand and pass. So foil is apparently 4 mana counter target spell. That's all the value I got out of it. I mean, I was able to play differently because I had it, but the best use of it for me was hard casting it. Not really saying a lot of good for the card. And then in game 2, of course, we get to do the old switcheroo if I want to. I bring in Red Blast. I saw no red cards, but I saw Volcanics, and that usually means that they're running I bring in Hydroblast because it usually means that they're running Blue Blast. They're running Red Blast in the sideboard, so I run Blue Blast to counter their potential unexpected sideboard. I take a Snapcaster or a Ponder out of their hand, leaving them with a Snapcaster. They get a Rest in Peace here, so I was all thinking I'm in good shape with the Entomb Reanimate stuff, and instead, not so great. We'll check off some of these lands that I know about. So now I just got to play a slow game. They got Snapcaster, Rest in Peace, the old combo that's been devastating for years, right? No, this is one of the problems with being the I'm not the Reanimator deck, is that you often end up like you want to hose graveyards, but graveyards are important in this format, so you frequently find yourself in a position where you're hosing yourself like this person is. Look, they've got a Mystic Sanctuary and a Snapcaster, not the combo with Rest in Peace, right? So we know they have a Mystic Sanctuary and 3 unknowns in their hand. I'm just going to slow roll all this. We'll use Douthie Voidwalker to bait. And obviously it doesn't feel like much bait to them because Rest in Peace. But on the other hand, it races a Snapcaster pretty well. I mean, it's 3 points of unblockable damage. So my opponent does seek to remove it. And in response, I believe... No, I just let it go. So they're down. I know one of their cards is a land, and I don't know what the rest is, and I go for an Echoing Truth here. And they brainstorm, and it bounces, so we're going to go for it. Tomb. Yeah, I didn't do the transformational sideboard because it was I just brought in the Echoes specifically to deal with whatever hate cards they had, and it works. Atraxa comes down. I lose life, but then I get to draw full hand again, and my opponent concedes. I wouldn't say I played that as well as I could have, but I played it well enough to get the win, I suppose. AJ Potato 2214 is my next opponent. We've got a few more to run through, and then we're done with this long video. I'm going to go take a mulligan here, tuck my big guy to the bottom of my deck, where I'll then pull it right out in a moment with my Entomb. One that leads off with Chrome Mox imprinting a Galvanic Relay, so we know that they're on, but they had to mulligan a bunch, and we know that that means they're on combo. Easy play here. We just simply grief them and then Entomb and then Force of Will, whatever their play is. But they with 3 cards in hand, they're toast. So we move on to game 2. Then of course I get to bring in the Damping Spheres. I get to bring in the Null Rods. Like, this gets so much worse for my opponent. And I've got to keep. I've got all of my colors of mana and some disruption. So first turn Wasteland against the Misty Rainforest. I'm hoping that this encourages them also as a convenience thing, not to crack the Misty, because I really want some extra time. And they don't. Don't know if it was because of the Wasteland or not, but I'm happy. Slam the Underground and Null Rod. Alright, so now they can't do any like Lotus, nonsense. They have to kind of go off the hard way. They do bin a Echoing Truth here, so they probably don't have too many Lotus Petals and such in their hand. So I'm going to, that means they probably have a hand with mostly rituals. So let's see how they do against Stealthy Voidwalker and a Wasteland activation. Alright, so they brainstorm. They could have another Beseju in their hand and then just Beseju the Null Rod, and I can't stop that, but yeah, they're ritualing here. Ritual, sure. Opal, yep. LED, yep. Beseech. And remember, they can't activate that LED. And then the Galvanic Relay. I'm not going to play into their Storm card. And there's no way, they have enough floating, there's no way I can double daze here for any kind of value. So all these cards with the flame symbol, I can actually cast with the Voidwalker. All the rest have been exiled to his effect. So I actually grab his Beseech the Mirror and play it. And I use his Beseech. Then I reanimate Stealthy Voidwalker and finally use his Beseech as a Demonic Tutor to grab a Damping Sphere, and then I just Damping Sphere my opponent. Now how does my opponent win now? Right? Like, absolutely, basically impossible. This is the turn where they're supposed to kill me, but now all their spells are going to progressively cost more and more mana, and it was because of the Stealthy there being able to use their Beseech. And of course the Null Rod. So if my opponent casts a spell here and then another spell, I'm going to daze whatever that second spell is anyway. Pretty much, I don't even know that they could. They have a Beseju available, Petal, Opal, none of that does anything. Burning Wish, Misty. So yeah, they could try to like Beseju away the Damping Sphere would be the play, and then slap down some of this artifact mana that doesn't do anything just to build up some Storm. Did they play a land already? Then maybe they could like Burning Wish and pass, but they have no cards in hand, so it doesn't really get them anywhere particularly useful, and they just lose. Alright, so AJ Potato is dead, and we go to Nasfe Awam, the only opponent on this day to have gotten even a single game against me. Alright, so this looks like a keep. Once upon a time's into Noble Hierarch, Verdance for a forest and a noble, so we can check that off. And they have some unknowns over there. I'm going to go ahead and leave that land on top. Looks good to me. They play an Arbor and then a Zenith for 1 for an Elvish Reclaimer. I don't fight with this because I have a Wasteland and a Stealthy, so if they're running Loam, I'm not super worried about it here. And if they're doing Dark Depth stuff, I do have a Wasteland, so I'm not gonna force a will that. Play Ignoble. They can put a lot of pressure on me if they want to. They decide not to there, so I'm okay with that. I ponder, seeing a Brainstorm. I'm going to go ahead and just cycle Troll because I don't want to Brainstorm into that. And we'll take a look for some new cards. I decided to, I'm going to get in there with 3 points of Shadow, unblockable. They're going to hit me back if they want to, but they crack a Elvish Reclaimer and go get Cradle. That's a tough one. Alright. Natural Order. I'm going to Brainstorm in response and hope to find something good. I find a Force of Will. Did they beat me? Did they just Natural Order again? Am I dead? Well, so far, no. They get a Fiend Artisan. Unfortunately, this will allow me to cast Natural Order but I can't pay the additional cost with the Douthie, so I can't actually natural order into my Atraxa, so it does not work. I had to Google it. I wasn't sure. Anyway, I entomb an Archon, waste their Cradle, which is nice to see go away. Hit him for 3. I'm just slightly ahead of him in damage, but I don't love my board state. At least, oh, and another Cradle comes down into a Grist, and they Grist, making a creature, and then get an Allosaurus Shepherd into play using the Fiend Artisan's ability. I'm not exactly sure why. Oh, well, this threatens to overrun me for a lot of damage, so that does make sense. But Grist isn't like super good against me here. I'm going to go ahead and hardcast to Grief, and we'll take whatever's... And my opponent Endurance is in response, shuffling away the Archon of Cruelty, something I did not want to see happen. So with the last card in their hand, and they have, by the way, an Atraxa that that they pitched to the Endurance. If they hadn't pitched the Atraxa to the Endurance, I could have griefed the Atraxa and then played it with the Douthie Voidwalker. Anyway, I attack Grist there and then pass. My opponent swings back for 10, and I chump and take 5. And they get Quirion Ranger, Dryad Arbor, and I go ahead and crack and try to cast a natural order to see if it works. I was trying to Google it, and I got the message that it doesn't work, but I figured I would double check here since this game was lost, and no, it doesn't actually work. So we move on to game 2, but now I get the sideboard, and my sideboard is pretty potent for this kind of nonsense. My opening hand though is great, so we'll just keep that. Orcish Bowmaster is really good against green, typically. When it leads off with Bayou into Thoughtseize. I'm going to try to craft my hand here so that I'm not troubled by that. They Thoughtseize away a Force of Will. I'm very happy to see that go, because I basically Force of Willed the Thoughtseize without having to discard an extra card or pay a life. I cost my opponent some life, as a matter of fact. Grab the Bowmasters that I hid on top from my opponent. Opponent then fetches out a forest and goes for a Zenith on 1, which is lovely, lovely, lovely when you're holding an Orcish Bowmasters. We'll go ahead and end of turn punish that a little bit. Pew! Alright, so for my turn, I draw a Douthie Voidwalker, lovely stuff, so I'm going to cast that, and then I'm going to grief my opponent, I believe. Let's see if we can hit something fat, like an Atraxa. Can we? Or are we waiting? Oh, I'm waiting. I'm being patient. I've got 4 mana. Why don't I just hardcast to grief? The Atraxa's not coming down anytime soon. And it makes more sense to just put pressure into play and just beat them with black cards, right? So, end of their turn, I'm actually going to cycle the Troll for value rather than pitching it to the grief for speed. And yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and draw. I draw my own Atraxa. I'm not thrilled with that, but let's see what we can get from my opponent's hand. Play a grief and my opponent concedes. I have to assume that they were holding an Atraxa here, because they immediately concede to grief here. But you know, even if they weren't, it's a problem for them, because grief and Douthie can just continuously crack them for it's double lightning bolt every turn, right? So we hit them to 11, and then we hit them to almost dead, and then we hit them to dead. So pretty bad for them there. So they just scoop. But I suspect they were holding a Atraxa, and I was about to Douthie and Atraxa into play is what I think was going to happen there. All right, so we move on to game 3. Opponent's obviously going first, but they have to double mulligan. This deck mulligans pretty well and doesn't have to mulligan too hard, and my opponent just decides that they're too far behind, and they scoop it up against this deck. So that was it. So we win. Dystopia never even came up. We just won with the core of the deck. Next is Habbo 13. And yeah, still with the singular Sabo's Web, which I think is a great card, but doesn't. It has a lot of value, and it replaces itself, and it fits very well into this deck. It's just that I cut an Animate Dead for it, and I think it makes more sense to run, like right here, I'd rather have another Animate Dead, right? So anyway, I'm going to grief my opponent and see what's going on over there. Oh, and I'm so dumb. This is exactly the moment where what the hell am I doing? Order Lol. All I have to do is Douthie Voidwalker and then Grief, and then I can just hard cast our Ulamog or whatever, and the game's over. But instead, I've made life a lot harder for myself. Well, fortunately, I can reanimate Grief off the top, cheat their Ulamog into play, Ulamog them, and my opponent concedes. Fortunately, my deck is like, well, you know, all's forgiven. Here, have a reanimate, and I instantly win. You can see the powerful interaction between Grief and Douthie actually take place there, right? Just a nuts, just being able to hard cast Ulamog on turn 2, which is what should have happened, or turn 3, which is what happened. Turn 2, I would have got this set up, and then turn 3, I would have hard cast it with Force of Will backup. It's just totally insane, right? So, game 2 against Hobble 13. Obviously, I'm bringing in Damping Sphere against the 8-post deck. And then I think I had a reason. I don't remember what the reason was for bringing in Null Rod. I don't remember what we saw in game 1 off the top of my head. But I'm going to grief them. I see Fairy Macabre and Karn, Vespian Sage, and a Glimmer Post. So I'm not going to reanimate this because I don't care about Karn too much. They can have their Karn. I've got better things to do. And then they have a Tormod's Crypt, and so bad. Oh, right, but I had Null Rod. That's why I brought in. Now I remember why I brought in Null Rods. Because I figured the best solution to Graveyard Hate was going to be artifacts for them. And they did have a ton of artifacts. Alright, so now that Tormod's Crypt's out of the way, we'll go ahead and entomb and reanimate a Archon of Cruelty, kill their Karn, and my opponent concedes. And that's it. So, my sideboard beats yours, basically. They have Fairy Macabre and Crypt, but Grief, pretty busted, and having Null Rod and such, you know, just really, really strong. And finally, we play AC, no DC. Alternating current only. Or maybe they don't like metal. They probably do, though. Alright, rock. Alright, so I take a mulligan. I think my first hand had no mana and no way to get mana. And then we mulligan into this one, which looks really, really good. Entomb and Animate Dead is quite nice. My opponent runs out a first turn Rolling Vortex off a Simian Spirit Guide. So if you're not familiar with this card, each of us are going to lose a life each turn. You can prevent your opponents from gaining life by paying a red, and if somebody casts a spell with no mana, it deals 5. So like if I cast Grief or Force of Will or Daze, I take 5 unless I pay the iron price for those cards, right? Unless I hard cast them. Actually, paying the iron price is paying the 5 life, but unless I hard cast them specifically. I'm going to entomb an Archon of Cruelty though and attack my opponent's hand. It's possible to beat Atraxa with a couple bolts. It's exceedingly hard / impossible to beat Archon with a couple of bolts, because you lose a card, you have basically one turn to do it, and after that, you keep losing cards, and then it just becomes impossible. So, you especially if you have an empty hand, of course, it is impossible at that point. So I'm going to Archon them, and then I'm going to Grief, because literally the only way I can think of to lose is double bolt, and after I just take whatever from them, I go ahead and Grief them, exiling Entomb, because I don't need another such effect. I'll pay the 5 life. I just gain 3, and I'm going to gain 3 every turn off of this thing. And I take Price of Progress out of the hand, revealing Mountain, Eidolon, Eidolon. So on their turn, they just play Mountain, Eidolon. That does not beat Archon of Cruelty. Alright, so we'll just swing in. That'll die. They discard the other one. I'll go ahead and play a land here, cast Douthie. Or no. Oh yeah, Entomb, Atraxa, and reanimate it. What the hell? And yeah, and then I'm going to Grief them too. And I'm going to pay the 5 life with the Rolling Vortex. I mean, why not? I mean, maybe I won't. Maybe that's a little aggressive. I'll just Force a Will if I need to, and pay the 5 life then, and then pay the 1 life during that. Get it all back and kill him. So that was game 1. And you can see the problem with trying to play a fair deck when you're playing against an unfair deck is that you just give up game 1. Like, this deck gets to start with, like, a high percentage of game 1s automatically won just because the opponent has no sideboard. So you're just like, I get to win game 1, and then we get to play, and then you get to try to play against a sideboarded deck, and you have to win twice in a row. It's extremely hard. Opponent mulligans into Leyline, double mulligans into Leyline, but of course I've sideboarded, I believe, I don't know if I went the full transformational, but I mean, they get a Monastery Swift Spear, they chain lightning me, like, whatever. I'm going to go ahead and Brainstorm here, I believe. Yeah. Yeah, no. Douthie Voidwalker into the Grief Plan. Seeing Price of Progress, so now I can cast Price if I want to. Obviously I don't and won't. But I got rid of one of my useless Animate Deads and traded in for a Price of Progress not hitting me in the face, which is very nice. Alright. I draw and pass, like I'm going to do something with Douthie just to try to encourage a swing, and I Bowmaster them. They play a Pyroblast, and I have absolutely no clue what the hell that was about, but I double block here and kill the Swift Spear. Oh, they were trying to make it a 2-3, so it would survive the double block, but so I would have to double block, I guess, to kill it, but, you know, I don't know. It was just not great. As far as things I've exiled over there, I can play a Price of Progress, Pyroblast, Monastery, Swift Spear. And you can see how hard it is. Like, sure, you're sideboarded against me, but can you beat the black part of my deck? Because if you can't beat the black cards in my deck, I don't need the Reanimator stuff. And eventually, I'm going to get to it, right? I'm going to just Echoing Truth and get to it. And with that, opponent's dead. And if they weren't dead, they're definitely dead. You know what I mean? Like, there's no... You know, this kind of a hand puts them in a pretty tough spot. The only way that they beat me is if they do something like Price of Progress, Fire Blast me. You know, Price of Progress, Bolt, Fire Blast kind of thing would kill me. But being aware of that, I'm not going to tap my Wasteland. Because if they Price of Progress, I'm just going to Wasteland myself and take 2 damage and not care. And then if they Fire Blast, I have Force of Will, so it doesn't really matter. And I can just finish them off here with these things. Plus, if they were to make a play like that, if they were to do like a bolt or whatever, and I force it, then they're just charging up Douthie Voidwalker to just throw it back at their face later. But yeah, the black side of the black half of the deck beats can win. And as I said, in that specific game, I had cut the 4 Entombs and the 2 cards here, and I left the Reanimates and Animate Deads in. Just so that I brought in the 6 blue cards, and I left those in just so that I could target their stuff if I wanted to, if I wasn't Douthieing them away, or I could get to a point where I start, I bounce their solution and then start throwing Trolls and Griefs into play. So, and that's basically the idea behind this deck. Works very well. As you saw, it's very reliable. It's not a new deck, in the sense that this is absolutely not my creation. It's just my spin on someone else's creation. But sometimes you gotta, swallow your pride and understand what the best deck is, and then just be willing to try to play it and master it so that you can win with it when you are going to be facing a lot of it. And in Legacy, from what I can tell, this is the highest percentage of deck played, as well as the highest win rate, but by a relatively small margin. Like, it's between 15 and 20%. Whereas all the other decks are some smaller number, and there's a robust variety, as you saw. But that still means it's the best deck of the format, and I want to build the best version possible. Hopefully this is it, but it may not be. We might make some more changes. I will definitely get to a point where I can run it through a tournament, and then we'll get some results from that and use that to feed it back into the algorithm and continue to build the deck. And in the meantime, I'd like to know what you thought about this deck, what you think could be done with this deck, if any changes need to be made. And I'm also quite interested in what you thought about watching Trix. If you watch this whole video and you got to see the Trix deck in action, what do you think about this? I am confident that there is a number of things that could be done to improve this. This is a very rough draft, yeah, what do you think about this deck? Like, for example, maybe this deck should be running City of Traders or Ancient Tombs, or maybe it should run Blood Moons, or who knows, right? So, what do you think about the 2 decks? I look forward to any thoughts, comments, and suggestions, and I want to say thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.